A lot of people are socialized to comply from a young age. And so we become wired to comply because we're rewarded for compliance. And even now, we see parents and grandparents saying, oh, she's so good. And that really means that she does what she's told. Yeah. And we don't get the same training in defiance that we do as in compliance. And then when we're in a situation, especially with someone who appears to be an authority figure, then we go along with it because we don't know how to resist. We don't know how to defy. We've never nourished that aspect of ourselves.
From a young age, we are taught to obey. In adult life, this makes us dangerously susceptible to the influence of authority figures, teachers, and outright con men who push us to comply with their ends even when it goes against our best interest. My guest, Dr. Sunita Sah of Cornell University, researches exactly this problem, and she believes that the solution lies in specific strategies to keep us aligned with our values, even under the greatest of pressures. She calls this skill defiance, and her work aims to transform our ideas about defiance from a negative trait into a crucial, positive force for personal change. In this interview, Dr. Sah will expose the forces of compliance in everyday life and share the specific practices we can use to stand up for ourselves when it matters most. Dr. Sunita Sah, you are a master of many fields. What prompted you to move from medicine to organizational psychology?
I grew up being very obedient. And in fact, when I was little, I asked my dad, what does my name Sunita mean? And he said, in Sanskrit, Sunita means good. And mostly I lived up to that. I was an obedient daughter, sort of dutiful student, did all my homework as expected, went to school on time, even had my hair cut the way my parents wanted me to. These were a lot of the messages I received from not just parents, but also teachers and the community, was to be good. And what do we mean by being good? It really means to obey, to do what other people want, to please them, to not question, to do as you're told. And we start equating being compliant with being good and defiant with being bad. I received these messages and I was really just expected to comply. And so my first career as a medical doctor was really due to expectations from the community. I think I was told at one point, medicine is the best thing you can do. And so I went off to medical school. In the UK, it's a 5-year, at the time it was a 5-year combined undergraduate and graduate degree. But I did do what we call an intercalated degree, my 3rd year, which meant I took a year out and I was put with the 4th year psychology students to earn a degree in 1 year. And I loved that time doing psychology. But being so good, I went back and I finished medicine and I ended up working as a junior doctor. So it took a few more steps before I ended up doing a PhD in organizational behavior, in organizational psychology, and ended up where I am now, which is a professor at Cornell, studying all things compliance and defiance.
So the jump to the PhD probably doesn't just happen overnight. Was there something that kind of stimulated that?
Well, when I was doing psychology, I came across Milgram Stanley's obedience to authority experiments, and I was fascinated by those when I read those experiments in psychology, not just because he had a very sharp sort of delineation between people that comply and people that defy, but when I read the studies, there were things that participants were doing that I recognized. So even though they were complying, they were showing signs of like nervous laughter, smiling, sweating. They didn't want to actually comply. So even though Milgram at one time called them moral imbeciles, I kind of recognized these are people who actually want to comply and harm another person. They're actually people that are trying to defy. They just don't have the skill to do it. And so after I did my medical degree, I actually did some consulting work for the pharmaceutical industry, first of all, and I became fascinated as to how the medical profession and industry interact with each other and how they influence each other and the many conflicts of interest that were there. And I remember talking to a professor at London Business School. I actually did an executive MBA there, first of all, and I was talking to them about wanting to delve into this in more depth. And they said, if you really want to look at conflicts of interest, you have to go to the US. So I ended up traveling to the US. I did a PhD in organizational behavior, and that led the path into sort of academia and becoming a professor. So as you can tell, Brad, it was all perfectly planned.
With a stack of degrees along the way.
Yes, I had an excellent training in compliance, I ended up getting 5 degrees.
And the Milgram experiments, what were those experiments?
Well, so those experiments, Stanley Milgram conducted them in the 1960s, and they're kind of infamous studies now. What he was very interested in was whether this claim from Nazis after World War II that we were just following orders was actually a psychological reality or not. And so he had participants come in. They were community members, and the ad was really for participants for a learning experiment. He wanted to see, allegedly, giving someone electric shocks would help their memory and help them learn faster. And so when the participants came in, they met another person who they thought was another participant. That person was actually an actor that was going to be the learner. And they saw the learner being strapped into this chair that really looked like an electric chair. The learner would have to try and remember and recall word pairs. And if they got a word pair incorrect, the teacher, which was the participant that came in, would have to give them an electric shock. So the teacher was then brought into another room where they had to sit in front of a big machine that was marked with different volts, starting at the lowest of 15 volts and then increasing in 15-volt increments all the way up to 450 volts, which was actually labeled XXX, severe danger, and all those things. And so they had to read out the word pairs. If the learner got a word pair wrong, the teacher would have to give an electric shock and continue up the scale in voltage. And the experimenter who was in the room with a grey lab coat, if the teacher hesitated or questioned or tried to push back, they had 4 prompts. So the experimenter would say, please go on. The experiment requires you to continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. And the last one was, you have no choice, you must go on. So if the teacher objected more than 4 times, then the experiment would end. They wouldn't have to go all the way to 450 volts. If not, they were asked to continue. The prediction from psychiatrists was that most people wouldn't continue after about 150 volts because that's already quite sort of high voltage. But what Milgram found in the first study that he ran was that every single person pulled the lever for 150 volts. Every single person pulled the lever for 300 volts, which was when the learner started pounding on the door. And then after that, there was just silence. The learner stopped responding, and yet still 65% of participants went all the way up to the final deadly 400.
And did they prime them too with something like this person's got a heart condition?
Yes, there was in one of the experiments where they said this person's got a heart condition, and the learner would even at 300 volts say, you need to stop, and mention that they needed to get out of the experiment and they would not continue. And there was reference also to their heart. And they had mentioned to the participant, the teacher beforehand, they had a heart condition.
Yeah. So it sounds so bizarre that people would do this to another human whom they don't know. And, there doesn't seem to be much incentive. And yet they do it. What do you think is going on? Stanley Milgram calls these people moral imbeciles. Are they moral imbeciles?
I don't think they are. I think they have not learnt how to defy and say no. And so it's very interesting that Milgram called the people that were compliant and went up to 450 volts the obedient subjects, and the ones that refused to, the defiant subjects. So here we can see there's some kind of reframing now of defiance, which I also think, this is something that I've done in my own work, is to redefine defiance as something that's positive and pro-social, in that we are not going to follow the orders of someone else. What Milgram thought was going on was this abdication of responsibility, that people would just think that the experimenter was in charge and then just follow orders. So you get what psychologists now call this ethical fading, that I'm going to sort of dissipate my responsibility to someone else, or I'm just not even going to think about the ethical aspects of this decision. What I think was going on, rather than a complete abdication of responsibility, is that in many of the participants, they felt a lot of tension. And you can see that tension when you read the descriptions from Milgram. As I said, they were sweating, swearing, asking questions, stuttering, smiling, laughing, which seems odd. But when you think about nervous laughter, and something that I call my crocodile smile is when I'm very uncomfortable, I have this automatic smile that comes along that I've learned to do to appease the other person. You'll see it's really because of this undernourished will to defy. They just don't have the skill set. And so even if you want to defy, if you don't know how to, if you've never trained for it, if you've never been taught how to do it, and many of us have been socialized for compliance the way that I was socialized for compliance, is something that we actually have to learn.
What a phrase. Undernourished will to comply. Is it like something that needs to be fed, or are we born that way and then we get broken down? What do you think?
I think that a lot of people are socialized to comply from a young age. And so we become wired to comply because we're rewarded for compliance. And even now, we see parents and grandparents saying, she's such a good girl, she's so good. And that really means that she does what she's told. And we don't get the same training in defiance that we do as in compliance. We don't get that same training. And then when we're in a situation, especially with someone who appears to be an authority figure, then we go along with it because we don't know how to resist. We don't know how to defy. We've never nourished that aspect of ourselves. And so I definitely think that defiance is not a personality trait. We tend to sort of think it's a characteristic of someone. It's a practice. And unless we practice it and nourish it and, nurture it, we're not going to be prepared when we're in the moment of crisis to be able to say no.
Yeah, it seems easy to accept that children would comply with things and that they're taught to. But with adults too, it continues through. Do you think adults are responsible for that as well, or is it something different?
I think we get taught it and we continue to do it. Surprisingly, a lot of people will say, when you're a teenager, you're sort of testing the boundaries a little bit here. And here we have to be a bit careful about what we call defiance or not. Because if you think about teenagers, and certainly my own teenager, at one point he would do the exact opposite of what I asked him to do. And if you think about that, it's definitely oppositional, but is it defiance? Because then we have to think about what is the definition of defiance? Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines as challenging the power of another person, sort of boldly and openly. And I'm not one to usually disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary, but I did grow up in the UK, and I think this definition is too narrow and it doesn't honor our agency. Because defiance isn't just about dominance or disruption. It's not rebellion for rebellion's sake. My definition of defiance is simply acting in accordance with your true values, especially if there's pressure to do otherwise. So if you go back to that teenager that's doing the exact opposite of what you're asking them to do, is that true defiance or not? Because if you think about it, they're actually listening very intently to their parent to do the exact opposite. So what they're doing is actually very much dependent on what you tell them to do. That's not true defiance. That's not something that's coming from within. That's something external. And so I call this false defiance because it's reliant on somebody else's wishes, whereas true defiance and actually true consent, which is just the other side of the same coin, is a thoroughly considered authorization that's an active expression of our deeply held values.
Yeah, this false defiance is interesting too. It seems that something like getting caught up in a mob. The mob could appear to be very defiant, but in fact, people are just kind of going along with the wave.
Yes, and we have seen that in several times where somebody is in a crowd and they get caught along with it. And even if they don't believe in the cause, that they're just going along and something's happening, whether it's herd behavior or compliance or even conformity with the rest of the crowd. they will say afterwards that that wasn't something that they actually believed. And we saw this the January the 6th, 2020 was of the Capitol riots, where a particular person, it was Clayton Mullins, he was not actually that political, and he believed the election to be a fair one. He only went along to the Save the America March because his wife and sister were going. And he went along with this, and when he was told to march to the Capitol, he did. And the video footage shows him sort of attacking a police officer on 2 different occasions. He pleaded guilty to the felony charge of assaulting a police officer. But as soon as that incident was over, when he was walking back to the car, he was very upset at what he had done. And he said, we should never have come here. And it doesn't go along with his values of peace and fairness. He was a devout Christian, and he was not known for being violent in any way. So what exactly happened there? Even though his values didn't align with what his actions showed that day, false defiance very much does look like true defiance, and it does look like you're acting your values. And so you get all the costs of defiance and the risks of defiance without actually believing in what you're doing.
Values are so important in this, and I want to put a pin in that so we come back to values. You have used another word, agency.
Mm-hmm.
In Milgram stuff, there's this talk of an agentic state. In
Yes.
cult literature, there's talk of making someone a deployable agent of the cult. What is this agency, this agentic state?
So Milgram talks about the agentic state of the participants that were obedient or that complied. And what he means there is that you abdicate your responsibility and you give it all away to someone else. So you're giving away your agency, you're giving away your power, and then actually you become the agent of somebody else, right? You're just acting for them, through them, but you're not taking any responsibility for that. And that aspect is that if you give away all your responsibility, this is actually something where then you don't feel you should be held accountable for what you do. So one of the biggest things about defiance, and if you look at the participants that were defiant in that experiment, they were actually taking responsibility. They would say, well, I'm not going to be responsible for harming someone else. So they recognized, and I call this the superpower of responsibility, is to really recognize that you're responsible for your actions. And they are, what you do becomes who you are. So you can't say, oh, this wasn't me, if you're repeatedly doing something. And so taking responsibility and also having the ability, the skill set to defy are the 2 things that enable you to act in alignment with your values.
With the Milgram experiment in particular, it's getting at another phenomenon maybe. I wonder, were they wearing white coats?
The experimenter?
The scientists, yeah.
Yes, the scientists actually deliberately, Milgram had them choose a grey lab coat. It's still a lab coat, so it still looks like an authority figure.
Yeah. I wonder, what are the sort of triggers that you think are pulled to make people get pushed into this kind of state?
Yeah, so definitely authority. If we just think about how difficult it is to say no to your physician, somebody who's supposed to have your best interest at heart, like a professor, a teacher, a physician, a priest, anyone in an authority figure where they're supposed to have your best interests at heart, it becomes very difficult to say no. But I've seen in some of my own experiments that I've run, like even in the simplest of experiments, even with a stranger with no consequences whatsoever, people find it very difficult to defy an order, even an unspoken one. So it could be an authority, it could be a peer, it could be a family member, it could be a stranger. I find this in all different types of situations.
Yeah. Are there other ones that are similarly as big, or is there sort of a gradation where authority is the top?
I think it really depends on the context. So in some experiments, there's a lot of different moderators, but having someone, so men, for example, I have a psychological construct that I've discovered in my research, which I think it would be useful to discuss. It's called insinuation anxiety. And this is a distinct type of anxiety that we feel when we're concerned about rejecting somebody else's order or suggestion. So if we think about anxiety, there's many different types of anxiety, and people are probably familiar with what we call social anxiety or performance anxiety, where we're worried about being evaluated by somebody else. Insinuation anxiety is the concern about sending a negative evaluation to someone else. So it's kind of in the reverse direction. So when somebody orders you to do something the way that Milgram had the experimenter do in his studies, or when the doctor tells you to take a particular procedure or a treatment, or the professor tells you to do something, or your boss tells you to do something. In these situations, it's very difficult to often say no because it sends a negative evaluation to the other person. So it either signals that you don't trust the other person, or you think they're incompetent, or you're sending some kind of negative evaluation. And that becomes really, really difficult. You don't want to insinuate, you don't want to imply that that person is not whom they appear to be, that they don't know best, that they possibly could be biased or corrupt. And so we end up going along with something even when we don't trust it. And there are a few of what psychologists call moderators of this effect. That means it could be amplified or it could be attenuated depending on the circumstances. So if that person is a man in general, you're more likely to feel more insinuation anxiety. If they're well dressed, if they're in a position of authority, all of these things, sort of signals of expertise, make it more difficult to say no and increase insinuation anxiety, which increases compliance.
What were you doing in your research that illuminated this phenomenon? Because when I read about it, I certainly recognized it, but I'd never heard someone put words to it.
Oh, I was really looking at, first of all, conflicts of interest in medicine. Having sort of observed, as I said, the relationship between the medical profession and the pharmaceutical industry when I was working as a doctor, I wanted to understand that influence in more detail. And there were a lot of regulations at the time, like, for example, the American Medical Association sort of states in its code of ethics way back in 2005, right, 20 years ago, that if you refer a patient to a clinical trial and if you receive a referral fee for that, you must disclose it to the patient. That's very important. And patients will say that they want to know. If their doctor has a conflict of interest, they want to know about it. So this seems like material information that you really should give to patients. And why? What's the reason for that? Is because if you know that your doctor has a conflict of interest, then there might be some uncertainty as to the quality of advice, so maybe you want to discount it a little bit. So this is really about protecting the patient. And I ran a series of studies where I had patients imagine that they were having an interaction with their doctor, and the doctor offered them sort of two different options, one of which was to enter a clinical trial, and that's what the doctor recommended. You should enter the trial. And in one condition, they disclosed the receipt of a referral fee, and in the other, there was no disclosure. And so what did we see? What we saw was that trust goes down with the disclosure of the referral fee, which is rational, right? There's some uncertainty. So yeah, maybe that's the intent of having a conflict of interest disclosure, is that you should have less trust. But at the same time, these patients felt more insinuation anxiety. And both of those things, how much you trusted the doctor and how much insinuation anxiety you had, both of those things affected whether you would take the advice or not. So it created a burden really on the patient or the advisee. First I started studying in medicine, then finance, and then many other contexts. And in all of these contexts, the burden ended up with the recipient of the advice to make the decision. Rather than protecting them, disclosure became a burden that they had to overcome.
Is there a measure for insinuation anxiety? Is it something that people self-report?
Yes, it is self-reported. So I would ask a series of questions as to how uncomfortable they felt to turn down the advice because it would send this negative signal to the other person.
I wonder about all this. I've seen situations where somebody pulls all these triggers. Say a man, he's well-dressed, he claims a certain authority, and like Stanley Milgram, it's easy to look down on these people. It seems like their brains have just shut off and they're all just like ducklings just following along. It gives me a lot more perspective, I think, to get a different look at this. When you see people like this, in this kind of situation, what do you think is useful for kind of shaking them out of it?
I think there's a number of things that is useful. I have a number of tools that I write about in my book that can help them. One of the first things is really to have a mindset shift about what it means to defy. Because if we think defiant, we have to break that equation that compliance equals good and defiance equals bad, and really understand that defying can often be the right thing to do. In fact, it can be bad to be so good. And when I started looking at this in my own research and what was going on around me at the time, I've read about one study which showed that 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, didn't feel comfortable speaking up when they saw a colleague or a physician making an error. So this could be the insinuation anxiety aspect again. So it could also be the reason why co-pilots don't say anything to their pilots. These are life and death situations, and we need a skill to really overcome these forces. And so first of all, having this mindset shift, if you think about defiance as only being for the brave or the extraordinary, we kind of excuse ourselves from doing the work. Defiance doesn't need to be loud, angry, aggressive, bold. It doesn't even need superhuman courage. It just needs you to act in alignment with your values. So that mindset shift is number one. Number two is really thinking about defiance as a practice, not a personality. And what do we do in order to nurture that is that we have to spend time practicing long before a moment of crisis. So how can we do that? Well, there's a lot of situations where we can predict that we will have to defy. So maybe the Milgram participants could not have predicted that particular situation, and that was going to happen to them on that day. But if you look at the people that were able to defy, like 2 of them stand out to me. One was an engineer, so someone who had a lot of knowledge about what electric shocks do to them. And he also had personal experience from his family about Nazi Germany. And he was really interested in, after he got told about the experiment and was debriefed afterwards, he was like, I really think psychology is so important now to study. And because he knew what electric shocks could do to another person, he was able to sort of defy in the end and be one of the deviant subjects. And even then, he regretted not stopping earlier. He was like, if you just give your responsibility to someone else, you're really just being a coward. You have to take responsibility for what you're doing. Another person that was able to defy was a teacher of ethics that had probably spent a long time thinking about values and ethics and what's important. And even though his voice shook a bit when the experimenter was given the prompts, such as the very last one, you have no choice, you must go on, I think his response was something along the lines of, maybe if we were in Russia, but not here, So there was some practice there of really thinking about what values are there and that clash between being told by someone to do something and harming another person. And they were able to resist in that situation. So how do we practice? So for many of us, we might have been in situations in the workplace or with particular friends or family where we often let our boundaries slide. And so we can start anticipating them. We can almost predict this is going to happen. Like I can predict as a faculty member, when I go into this particular meeting with these particular people, this person is going to say something offensive because this person has said something offensive in every single meeting that we've had. And so you can predict these things. And once you know that, you can start to visualize and anticipate those situations. Because if you can do that, then you can start scripting out what you wish you had said. Well, the next time I'm in this situation, this is what I want to say. And we start rehearsing it. And why that is so important is if we have been socialized to be compliant and our brains have become wired and those neurons have become really strong in that way, we need to rewire. And the only way to do that is to practice and train ourselves. So mouths get used to saying defiant words and our ears get used to hearing them. That's the only thing that's going to change that neural pathway. And I think there's a wonderful quote that's often attributed to Bruce Lee, which is quite apt because, it's martial arts and that requires a lot of training. But it was actually a Greek poet that said, under duress, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. And so understanding that defiance is a skill and something that we can train for, just like we train for anything else, is really crucial.
Yes. And I'm so glad you're saying this because I think people often chalk up dealing with these sort of situations as something that you kind of have to take them as they come. Maybe you can't really be prepared, or maybe the only people who know how to deal with it are those who have been through it before. But having a proactive approach is very empowering for people. I'd like to ask about a couple of other things related to this, but first, anything else on this practice element?
I think Having some scripts in your back pocket is really useful. Something that's natural to you, that if you're caught in that situation and you're feeling that tension, which I talk about as being like that tension is the first stage of defiance, is having some of these scripts that you can say, such as, what do you mean by that, right? Rather than just letting the situation slide, you can just ask. You're still in a subservient position at that point. You're just asking for clarity. Well, what do you mean by that? Can you clarify that? I'm not comfortable with that. Let me think about it and get back to you. Just having a few of those scripts and choosing the ones that feel most natural for you and practicing over and over again. So that becomes your default response instead of your default silence or automatic compliance. This is something that we can all do.
Yeah. The script thing is tremendous because when you deal with people who are pushing other people, they're often masters of the verbal judo. They've got all the right things to say and they know what to do and how to shut people down. So to have those scripts in your pocket sounds tremendously helpful. And it reminds me, you talked a little bit about flying. I used to fly in the U.S. Navy. And when we needed to discuss things and bring things up while flying, we had words to say. We had things from the checklist. It was already there. And it really was necessary because you are conditioned in flying to grow to trust the senior pilot so much. When you're a student pilot, you can be sharing a helicopter with an instructor pilot, and you will be forced to put the aircraft into positions that you cannot recover. And you know that. And then the instructor pilot says, I have the controls, and they save your life. and that's day in, day out, how you get used to doing business. So when you have to then be a junior pilot flying along with somebody and to recognize things, you need a script. So I'm so glad that we're talking about the importance of scripts. Beyond that, other things outside of the practice, I think values comes to mind, kind of identifying your values, but that's more of a step back.
It is more of a step back because most people don't think about their values unless they're explicitly asked to.
Yeah.
So I certainly, with my MBA students and executive students, ask them to think about their values, like what's very important to them and why is it important? And I have them write it down. And the reason that I do this is if we can have clarity over our values and we can write them down, the research shows that we're more likely to act in alignment with them. So that's really important. And it also decreases our cortisol levels. We feel far less stress if we know who we are and how we want to act. So we're not caught in those situations where we don't know whether we should comply or not. We know who we are, and we know that if we act a certain way, that goes against who we are. So I teach a lot of healthcare students, and a lot of them will tell me how, reduction of suffering was somebody's value that they said, like they saw their childhood friend suffer from a disease and die, and that was what they wanted to do for the rest of their lives. Another told me a story about integrity and why it was so important to him, and that when he was young, he was a Boy Scout, and he was really looking forward to this field trip that they were going to make, and he sort of turned up and he had his uniform on and thinking about all the badges he was going to get. So an hour went by, 2 hours went by, and the Scoutmaster didn't turn up. And even like 20 years later or 25 years later, whatever it was, when he was sat in my classroom, there was still disbelief in his voice when he told me he just didn't turn up. He just didn't turn up. And then later on, he heard this person talking about the trip as if it happened, and he knew how disappointed he was, and he said, that made him really value integrity, and he was like, I want to live that value every single day where I turn up with integrity. So knowing your values is really important, and I have what I call a defiance compass, in that's the first step. Who am I? Is really identifying your values before you look externally at what type of situation is this, and then you assess the environment. Is it safe for me to defy? Will it have positive impact? They're the two questions we ask in that situation. And then the last one is, what does a person like me do in a situation such as this? And here it goes back to the responsibility that we spoke about. Like, how do I take responsibility? And then also the skill set, the ability to actually defy. Have I worked on my practice? Do I know what to say? And how can I say that in this situation?
So we have the values, which I think now we've covered pretty well. Then this, is it safe? Is it effective? And then this sort of identity question. Am I that kind of person? What would a person like me do? So let's go a little bit deeper on the when to do this. Is it safe? Is it effective? How do we assess that?
So what I found in my research is like when I'm looking at sort of workplaces or even hospitals, I interviewed sort of 50 nurse managers and nurses. And what I find here is that why don't nurses speak up about errors or other things? The two main reasons are it doesn't feel safe for them to speak up. What are going to be the consequences? Are they going to lose their job? What repercussions are there going to be for them? So the first question they tend to ask is it safe? The second one that a lot of nurses said was like, I'm not worried about speaking up. I don't have any fear about speaking up. In fact, I've spoken up many times, but nothing happens, nothing changes. And so this aspect of will it be effective? Will it have positive impact? So those two questions for anyone in a situation that would like to create a culture of safety, not just psychological safety, but safety in many different dimensions, so that being defiant or speaking up is not just encouraged, but it's rewarded, is really important. And when people do, taking action on it, making it effective, not just saying, great, thank you very much, and not doing anything about it. So what I encourage is for people to think, is it safe enough? Will it be effective enough? Because we can always give ourselves an excuse or a rationalization that defiance is never perfectly safe. But then again, neither is compliance. Compliance comes with lots of costs that we don't think about, the stress, anxiety, depression, dissatisfaction, chronic inflammation. If you're constantly giving away your values, not living your life with your values, and allowing your boundaries to be overstepped, it takes a great toll on you, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, and of course then physically. And so there is a cost with compliance that most people overlook. They only think about the costs of defiance, and we need to think about both.
Yeah, and feeling like you're not going to be effective is really tough for people. I talk a lot on this show about dealing with people who are pathologically narcissistic, highly manipulative, and a lot of people recognize that this is happening in someone close to them, but they are afraid that if they intervene, it won't work, and if anything, it will backfire on them, and so they don't bother. But then they watch, someone they're close to, a friend, as they sort of, deeper and deeper into the orbit of a pathologically narcissistic person and continue to be, exploited and things like that. Before we move on to the last part of this trifecta, any thoughts on intervening with people that's effective that you've maybe learned from your research or your education?
Intervening in terms of somebody else coming along to help that other person?
Yeah. If you recognize a problem in a friend or something.
So one of the reasons I wrote the book is that there's so many books out there about how to influence other people, how to get other people to say yes. And I really thought, well, there's something missing here. How do we protect ourselves from unwanted influence? And this is what I wanted to write my book on, because it is so easy to be influenced by someone else and then make excuses and rationalize and then find yourself really struggling to get out of that, because especially if you've said yes early on, it becomes harder. And even Stanley Milgram discovered in his experiments that it's the people that said if they said no early on, it's much easier. If you start to say yes at the lower voltage levels, it becomes harder and harder because you've committed. And so just learning these sort of red flags and signs is, first of all, really important. In terms of somebody else helping, there's a couple of situations that help. If you see somebody else, like a role model or an ally in a similar situation, say no. It just takes one person for you to then learn how to say it and actually act in a way that's in alignment with what you want. It decreases the pressure so much more. So when there were two teachers in the room, and one of the other teachers, who was also an actor, was told, like at a certain voltage, maybe 150 volts or 300 volts, you're going to say no to the experimenter. Then the other teacher found it so much easier to do it. There's also something that I call quiet defiance, which is sort of saying no without publicly saying no. So in situations where you don't think it's safe to say no, or you don't know what the consequence is, there are ways to avoid doing what you're being asked to do without sort of publicly saying you're not doing it. And I found this really fascinating in one variation of Milgram's studies where the experimenter was not in the room with the teacher. They were given the orders by telephone. And what was fascinating here was that the teachers would reassure the experimenter that they were still giving the electric shocks, but in reality, they were just pressing the lower shocks, the 15 volts all the time, rather than going up in increments. And now some people might say, oh, but if integrity is a value, you're violating that value in that situation. You've got to think about whether your value of not harming someone else is greater than telling someone you are, because that's more comfortable for you to avoid that confrontation and avoid harming someone else. So there are ways that you could learn about quiet defiance, or finding an ally, or finding a way to defy that's more natural and easier for you. So one of the things I've found in my own life, because it was a struggle for me to discover how to say no and to defy, was that when it came to my son, it was far easier for me to say no to teachers and to doctors and things like that than it is for myself, because I felt so responsible for my son. This is where I had to step in. So thinking about, often it's easier to say no and defy for a loved one. So if you have a loved one that can help you in those situations, that definitely makes a difference. Having someone that's on your side, someone who's taking responsibility, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's also taking responsibility for yourself and learning how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this. First of all, that's beautiful that, we have an easier time sometimes sticking up for others. And,
Yes.
there are studies that people are better about giving their dogs medication on time than they are in giving themselves medication on time. So in a way, it's a beautiful thing, even though we have this part of our nature that we need to overcome. And I'll add to, just in my personal experience, seeing somebody who was also in authority resist authority was very helpful for me.
Yes.
So a friend of mine who is a medical student applying to residencies in psychiatry and has dealt with someone in her family who has narcissistic personality disorder, when she said, I see a problem with that guy and I don't want to be around him, it was like, well, she would know. And that was a great guide in just seeing her behavior and hearing her say that, whether or not she tried to intervene with others or not. So I like all of this. Do you have something more to say there?
Yeah, role models, I think, are really influential. So a lot of people that I spoke to, especially after the book came out, they would tell me stories about seeing their parents defy and how it stayed with them. And I also have a couple of my own stories where, even though I found my parents to also be quite compliant, the moments that they were defiant really made a difference to me, and it stayed with me. So, and like it does with many people who told me stories about how their parents resisted in a situation that was very, very difficult and what it meant to them. So we do parent a lot for compliance, that we want our children to be well behaved, to do what the teacher says, but we also need to train them for defiance. And I think that's very important, because this is the society that we're creating, and we want people to do the right thing in difficult situations. So we need to give them that skill set of defiance as well as compliance.
Yeah. And you want your child to be able to defend themselves when you're not around.
Yes.
Stick up for themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we talked about values. We've talked about, is it safe? Is it effective? And the last part, is this something that a person like me would do?
Yes.
What is that about?
So that's the bridge between identity and action, right? So connecting who you are with what you do. Because a lot of people will say, I don't know if you've heard people saying, oh, that wasn't me, maybe it wasn't. But if you do the same thing over and over again, it does become who you are, and it does change who you are as well. And so if we have this aspirational self of like, this is how we want to behave. And I'm now starting to do more work with younger people in middle school and high school to think about, like, what would you admire about yourself in 5 years' time? What is the person you want to become, and to behave in that way, then we can get the connection. Because what I see a lot of, and what my research has shown me over and over again, is what somebody believes their values to be is actually often quite different from how they actually behave. So how can we get there? Since we're so influenced by other people all the time, learning how to defy is really, really important. And even what you were saying about children, we want them to be able to do the right thing. And there was a survey of over 20,000 high school students. And in that survey, and this has been repeated many times, what it showed was that nearly 2/3 of the students admitted to cheating on a test. Nearly 2/3. Nearly 1/3 had confessed to stealing something from a store in the past year. Right, in the past year, which I thought was quite high. And then over 80% of the high school students said that they had lied to their parents about something significant. And these figures are likely to be conservative because 1 in 4 of them also admitted at the end that they'd lied on at least one question in the survey. So it's not just unique to high school students. We find that our actions are not often aligned with who we think we are. And how do we decrease that gap between who we think we are and what we actually do? And that's what the Defiance Compass is about. Like, what does a person like me with these values of integrity, compassion, whatever our values are, what does a person like me do in a situation such as this? And then if we can connect with that, if we can connect with our responsibility and we have the skill set, then we can define the situations that we need to.
Yeah. With this, I'm seeing a sticking point, which would be if you get involved with a person who really wants to manipulate you, they will try to wear down your sense of your identity and they will gaslight you. And so when you have been chronically gaslighted, you will wonder what your values even are. You will really struggle to know yourself, and to answer questions like, what would a person like me do in this situation, becomes even harder. Would you have thoughts on how to prevent getting that far, or how to reconnect to that part of yourself, or anything else on this?
Yeah, it's very difficult because your sense of reality has gone, right? You don't know what's true and what is not true in those situations. The biggest thing is to protect yourself before you get into that situation. And that's really understanding it goes back to the values, who you are right at the very beginning. Having role models, again, would be fantastic, of seeing people in those situations and understanding this is not a great situation for me. So how can we get our children, our teenagers, to not be influenced by their peers when, they're not going to go and steal something from a store if you've already learned how to say no in those situations, if you're okay with not being liked in certain situations. One of the things is like people saying, oh, do children actually know their values? Actually, they do. Like even very young children, they know about fairness, especially if they've got siblings. We all what is the fair half? You have the bigger half. So they learn very early on about fairness, about empathy, about being excluded. And so one thing that I'm talking to sort of a middle school about is like there have been situations where on group chats, people have said things, think people have been very mean, and they're reflecting on why didn't somebody say something on a school trip? How did they end up having that mob mentality and going after certain people? Like, what can you do in that situation, and learning those skill sets? So I think starting from a younger age and having these protective skills and these thoughts about how can I act true to myself before somebody else takes that sense of self from me, is really important. And then I guess when you said, is there something that can pull them back? I think it's constant reminders of who you used to be. So just that constant reminders of who you used to be. So I was speaking with somebody who had been in a cult, and I interviewed them as to how they managed to get out of the cult. And what she said to me was that her family were always there. No matter how many years she spent there, they were always there, just constantly reminding her of who she used to be. And that gave a lot of strength at the end of the day.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, and if you lose that sense, it's tough. I know in my own experience, I had a meditation practice and a journaling practice, and then when this person came into my life, for some reason that didn't seem so important, or I seemed too busy to keep up with it. And as soon as I got away, I wanted to get back to the meditation and journaling. I looked back at my own journals to kind of reconnect with who I am and what I'd been through on that journey. I'm particularly interested in one sort of tactical thing. You mentioned group chats. With the dangerous person that I've seen, his favorite move is to immediately get people into a group chat of all of his sycophants so that it seems as though he's a real authority already and that all these people must be supporting him and they're liking things that he says and stuff like that. Was there anything specific for avoiding the groupthink in a group chat?
So now we have that group chat, right, where it's all digital, but we've seen this, long before that in person, where everybody's just going along with everybody else, right, in a situation, because it becomes very difficult to say no in that situation. And this goes back to, again, this like one aspect of insinuation anxiety is that you have this really aversive emotional state where you become so concerned with offending the other person that, it becomes really hard to insinuate that somebody could be doing anything wrong in this situation. And it becomes even more difficult when there's other people present. So when nurses don't speak up, one of them was telling me it's even harder when it happens in front of the patient. How are you supposed to say anything in that situation? Because they have this sense of authority, the sense of expertise. So it's not just about approaching them. It's also about saving their face in front of the patient too. And so we've had that dynamic play out, not just in group chats, but in person. Whenever we get a crowd of people, it becomes so much more difficult. This is what the Ash conformity experiments were all about. Again, you just need one other person. You need one other ally. And even talking to the, other people in the chat and just sort of asking them like on a one-to-one, what do they really think? You might find your ally that way.
And for those who don't know, what were the Ash conformity experiments?
So the Ash conformity experiments were when people were looking at sort of different lines, right? So you might have, I'll just make up these figures, but they were 3 lines. Like one is maybe 1 inch, one is 2 inches, one is 3 inches. And then you are shown a comparison line and you can see, oh, that's definitely 2 inches. That's like B. Like, so if A is 1 and B is 2 and C is 3 inches, that's B. And then everybody else in the group going one by one says it's A. And you're thinking, what is happening? And it becomes very difficult for you to say what your eyes are actually telling you that is B. And so people go along with it. But if there's one other person in that room that says B, that's all it takes for you to change your mind and say, actually, it is B, and be confident in saying what your eyes are actually seeing.
But if no one does,
it's
then
very difficult.
It's interesting. A lot of these studies that we're talking about, maybe all of them, have been deception studies. And so what this is also pointing to is when you're dealing with deception as a human being, sometimes I think we have great abilities to recognize when somebody is a little off, but sometimes I think we are easily deceived. What do you think it is that distinguishes those moments when we are easily deceived?
In these experiments, people in the Ash experiment, they know that something is wrong. In the Milgram experiments, they know something is wrong. And there's that element of surprise to begin with, that this could not possibly happen in this situation. If it were to happen again, then they would be prepared, right? And so when we think about those situations, I often say it's not enough to just intellectually think about them, because one of the things I've looked into, and I've interviewed quite a few sort of rookie police officers and more senior police officers, and the rookie police officers that go into the academy, they might have like all the best intentions of like, this is how I'm going to behave if I'm asked to look the other way or if something unethical happens. But only if you've been trained behaviorally are you actually to be able to do it. And what I mean by that is you can't just read a book that says, oh, if you see something, you must speak up. So intellectually, we know this. But if behaviorally it's not ingrained in us, that we have not tried it out like some kind of martial art or sports, our body doesn't respond in that way. And then it goes back to the practice. What happens in this situation? And one of the rookie officers that I interviewed, who was able to speak up quite early on in his career to sort of senior police officers and a group of senior police officers, told me that I knew in this job I would see unethical things. I knew I would be asked to do something unethical, and I didn't want to be that person. So even though my childhood stutter came back, I knew what was the right thing to do in this situation. And he had thought about it, he'd anticipated it, he'd visualized it, and he knew that he didn't want to go along with something that the others wanted to. And so this aspect of practice, again, it comes back to visualizing, anticipating, changing those neural pathways and getting it in your body. So behaviorally, we know it.
So we talked a lot about being taught or conditioned these things, about social pressure. Any evolutionary genetic element to this as well?
I mean, we always want to be part of a group and we want to have harmonious relationships. And that's, what insinuation anxiety is all about as well, that we do have relationships concerns. There's 2 parts of us that some psychologists talk about. We have this independent part where we want to have our own agency, our own autonomy. We want to do what we want to do. And then we have the interdependent part where we value harmonious relationships. We want to be part of a community. And we want to belong. And those 2 selves are always in tension with each other. And so, the reason we have insinuation anxiety is because we want harmony. And sometimes that's good, right? Sometimes we want to think about whether our action is going to harm someone else. But we also have to think about the bigger picture. Okay, the nurse might not want to offend the physician, but what about harming herself in her own role as the job, or himself, own role in the job? We need to sort of step back and see what is the larger picture here and what's happening and the harm that we might be creating to ourselves and to other people. And that's why, I really want to reframe defiance from this negative aspect that can harm other people into this proactive, positive force in our community that actually makes a difference, because these things affect our workplaces, our communities, our lives. And that's why every single act that we do of consent and dissent and compliance affects the people around us, and it creates the culture, it creates the world that we live in. And it's so important for us to think deeply about that.
Yeah. Perhaps it can be hard for us to recognize when our compliance is actually a negative for others. How do we recognize when we are really responsible for defying and for, in a way, helping others through that?
Yeah, sometimes we are very aware of that, how our actions have an impact on other people. So the Milgram participants for sure knew that they didn't want to harm other people. So you're aware of that. If you're in a meeting and somebody's saying something derogatory about somebody that isn't there, then you know that by remaining silent, you're also creating some harm in that situation or allowing these things to continue. There is this aspect of, I mentioned before about ethical fading, that often, especially if you're in a business environment or a workplace where the culture is so that you're trying to please the boss, if that becomes your narrow frame of vision and you assess how good you are or how well you've done your work from how well you have obeyed your boss. And again, coming back to the Milgram experiments, if the participants only viewed their role as in how well they're taking the orders from the experimenter, that becomes your narrow vision of how good am I at complying? How good an employee am I by doing what my boss tells me to do? And really, we need to not have such a narrow frame of reference. We need to think, why am I doing this job? What is the reason to do this? And as I mentioned, I teach a lot of healthcare professionals, and often when we're having discussions, I will say, well, just step back. Why did you decide to have this career in the first place? And then connect in again with your values. So it's right back to, what are my values? And then we can think about the bigger picture and how we want to act.
So how to do it in a tactical level? Is it as simple as stepping back if you can get space from other people and a little self-talk like that?
I think I have something I call the power of the pause. So we're not just going along with our automatic reaction straight away. And hopefully that automatic reaction is going to come up with those scripts in time. Yes, taking either physical distance, if you can, that's the best thing. Let me think about it, I'll get back to you. Or if you can't, some psychological distance. So talking to yourself in the third person really helps. So you can sort of say, Brad, is this something that really sits well with me? The other thing you can do, as I mentioned, I have these 5 stages of defiance that we can really get comfortable with and thinking about as like a framework. We don't have to sort of do each step in order. We might not get through all the stages, but understanding it gives us a frame of reference. And knowing that that first stage of defiance is actually feeling tension. And that's like normal, because often when we feel tension, we try to disregard it and say, oh no, that's something I've just got to overcome, or the other person probably knows best. And instead of having those thoughts, it's really acknowledging, the second stage is really acknowledging that tension. So often we feel tension is quite unique to us in a particular way. So some people will feel some unease in their stomach, other people will get a headache, some people will feel like their throat is constricting or they have a dry mouth, some people will feel a racing heart. There's many different ways that it can manifest. But it's really getting to understand, I'm feeling this tension between what I'm expected to do and what I think is the right thing to do. So stage 2 is really acknowledging that. And then the stage 3 of defiance is vocalizing that to someone else, right? Telling someone else, I'm not comfortable with this. And as I said, you can still be in a subservient position there, but that stage is critical, because once you've put it out in the environment, things start to change, because now it's not as easy for you to go back in time and say, oh, actually, I was fine with that, because there's too much cognitive dissonance. You've already said you're not fine with it. So saying that in the moment, I'm not sure, I'm not comfortable with this, really does make a big difference. You're much more likely to get to that final act of defiance if you can get to stage 3 and vocalize that discomfort to someone else. Then stage 4 is your kind of threat of non-compliance. I can't go along with this. And then it's sticking to that, even though somebody might be trying to get you to go back down to the lower stages. Like as we know, like in the Milgram experiments, there were 4 prompts and you have to stick with that. No, I can't. I cannot. Thank you, but no. And then that final act of defiance, stage 5, what the research shows, and my research as well, is that if you can get to that final stage, that tension that we spoke about in the first stage, it just mitigates, it melts away. And that is wonderful because there's a lot more honesty and joy and feeling proud if you can get to that stage, that you're living a more authentic life rather than trying to get rid of the tension in the first place and then have it like come back to you at another point and resentment build up and all those costs of compliance that I mentioned.
Hearing these strategies, I think about the counter strategy of a manipulative person. And if the strategy is a lot of slowing down, checking in with yourself and getting some distance, then of course people say that like speed in relationships is a red flag. But here's a great explanation as to why. If there's speed, if someone is in your space or on your phone all the time, then when are you going to get that chance to check in with yourself? And more opportunities for them to diz you, confuse you, gaslight you, and so on. So we talk about tension. I mean, there is a tension between these sort of behaviors and the things that are actually good for us when kind of understanding where our values really lie.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, is like having that time to step back, check in with yourself, maybe check in with people you've known for a long time that you trust from your past, get back to who you were, especially if you find yourself getting carried along with something and you might have those little bits of doubts or that tension and not listening to it, sort of disregarding it, really focus on what does this mean? It doesn't mean that we have a knee-jerk reaction, or I'm not talking about sort of a gut feeling. I'm talking about really, I'm feeling tension and examining it and wondering why. Why is it that I feel that tension?
With all of this, you have some great examples from real life in your book. I wonder, what are examples maybe from fiction, movies, things like that people might enjoy?
Ooh, I mean, there's so many, right? Like I'm thinking of quite a dark one right now. And I actually can't remember the movie name, but it is something I've discussed with friends, is that like it was a movie about a serial murderer. And it comes a point in the movie where the person actually knows who the murderer is. And the murderer knows that they know, but it's not spoken about, right? So this aspect of insinuation anxiety, I'm not going to say that. So, and they're in a situation where they're in their house and they ask the murderer to leave. The murderer does leave and they're kind of relieved. But then they come back to the door and ask to be let in. And in that situation, the murderer knows that you know that you know. And still that person couldn't say no and let them back into the house, right? And I'm like, no. And this just really shows like how that sort of aspect that we have in the society of not insinuating that someone is not whom they appear to be or who they should be, right? Really gets us into this emotional state where we become so concerned with offending the other person, we let them into the house to murderers, So that is one that really stands out. But you can see it in so many interactions that we have in movies and probably in our own lives, mundane things as well as like these really serious things about in hospitals and on airplanes. Like after I had my son and I was going out with a group of mothers in London, and we hadn't been out for so long and we were so looking forward to this, and we had a lunch arranged. And we went to this restaurant we thought would be great. And then the food was so bad and it was really salty and we were all complaining. And then, of course, they come round and said, is everything okay? And we're all like, yes, everything's fine. And another example, which a lot of people can relate to, I think, is going to the hairdresser and they're telling you, just trust me with this new cut. And they're cutting away and you're thinking, no, stop, stop. And yet you don't say anything at all. And if you're like me, you probably thank them and pay them a tip and leave. And then, so it's all over the place. Once you become aware of this and you look at the interactions, you will recognize insinuation anxiety all over the place. And you'll also think these sort of small acts of defiance, they don't have to be confrontational, is where we can start building our skill set. We can start small and practicing in these situations. And that really does become something that helps us when we are actually in that moment of crisis that we hope that we're never going to be in. But if we are, that's going to help our skills come up to the level that we need it to be.
Yeah. It seems that sales environments would be a place for this, where maybe the long-term consequences are fairly low, and yet the skill set of the opposing party could be very high, and a place to maybe step into it.
Absolutely. Like I talk about like the sales pitch effect, right? It's got a similar force as insinuation anxiety. And here, rather than the signal being, you're not who you think, I don't want to insinuate that you can't be trusted or that you're incompetent. The signal now is I don't want to appear unhelpful, because I know that if I take this particular product or buy this thing from you, you're going to get some commission, right? And so, I think both insinuation anxiety and the sales pitch effect are in place there. And what's interesting here is that, again, this is a situation where you know that the other person is there for a commission or that they're selling you something. And so it helps them. And yet you feel a lot of pressure. And again, this is the type of situation where you don't want to make a decision on the spot. So being aware of that is really important. So whenever I see something like, offer is only there for the next 10 minutes or something, it's like, well, then that was never mine to begin with, and people have this a lot with buying houses, which is a really big purchase. And they're like, you've got to put an offer in right now, otherwise somebody else is going to get it. And the pressure is all there. And you have to understand that it's not that you're going to lose it, because you actually don't have it to begin with. And just trying to resist some of that pressure to go along with something so you don't end up with something that you can't afford.
And then some of the best tactics are the ones that don't seem high pressure. The free sample at the farmer's market that then turns into a discussion and a conversation about the product that then escalates into, all of a sudden I walk away with things I never needed.
Right. And they're playing on that sort of reciprocity aspect there. And definitely that's a very hard one. We are wired to reciprocate. So the free sample, you wouldn't get a free sample if it didn't help with sales. And it's always great. It's fantastic to get a free sample, but sometimes you have to see whether you still like it 24 hours later, So I think just saying that you want to see how this plays out, something looks good or something tastes good, but let's see if you still feel that same way 24 hours later. And if you do, maybe there's something in it, but resisting that aspect of these different influence tactics, which are sort of reciprocity, scarcity, that, you're going to lose it if you don't get it. Immediately, all of these expertise, authority, all of these aspects really, really influence us. And it's understanding those things. And as I said, there's so many books about how can I influence someone else, but we really also need to learn how can I prevent unwanted influence.
Absolutely. And then they get abstracted too. I mean, somebody might not claim that they have authority, but they're representing somebody with authority. There are so many layers to figure out. You have to be conscious of it. Yeah. Well, Dr. Sunita Sah, before we get to our last topic, where's the best place for people to look for you online?
So you could go to my website, which is sunitasah.com. So it's SUNITASAH.com. And there people can connect with me on social media. I also have a free newsletter where I write about some of these topics. You can also suggest topics that you would like to see in the newsletter. It's a Substack called Defiant by Design. If you go to my website, you'll see a way to sign up for that newsletter as well. And the book is sold in all major retailers. And you can also get that from my website too.
Excellent.
Yes, Defy, the power of no in a world that demands yes.
We'll put some links in the description for people to check out.
Wonderful.
And Sunita, our final topic is really you. What's it been like for you to go on this journey and to work through all this stuff?
For me, this is really my life's work. As I said, it was my professional work, but also personal, because I grew up with that masterclass in compliance. And so what I really I'm aiming to do, my strong desire, is to make defiance accessible to everyone. Like for those people that sort of think that, oh, I really did want to define that situation. I did really want to speak up when it matters, but I couldn't. I didn't have the skill set, or I found myself in this situation and I really struggled with it. It's to learn that skill set and understand that we have misunderstood all our lives what it means to defy. We don't really understand what compliance is or what true consent is, why consent might differ from compliance. To get to a stage where you can be in a situation where you don't regret not doing something that you really wanted to do. And the research and the book, actually writing the book, have really changed my lives, and it's changed my life, and I really hope it affects other readers in the same way.
When you say it's changed your life, what does that mean?
It means I have been able to find defiance more accessible in the situations that I need it. And I've also been able to sort of communicate that and teach that to other people. And they, one of the best things is when you have readers write to you about how much the book meant to them, how much it's changed their lives, how a lot of people that have been carrying shame with them for many years about something they did or something they didn't do, and that they've really understood why now that happened. It's like relieved a lot from them. And just being able to affect people's lives in that way, it means a lot, and it changes me too, it affects me too. So as I said, it really is my life's work. And so if I can make defiance accessible, and I'm also a bit of an idealist, so if we can improve society, one choice, one consent, one dissent at a time, that will make me very happy.
And in yourself, what keeps you from sort of backsliding? Any tricks that keep you on topic, or is by virtue of teaching it, does that kind of make you that way?
I mean, it's very prominent in my mind, but again, we're going back to values. What is it who do you want to be, and what type of person do you want to be in that situation? And what change do you want to see in the world, right? Because this is what values are about. Like if fairness, if justice, if these things are really important to you, and understanding exactly what a value is and how it's different from a belief or a goal, or it's not about something is right or something is wrong. It's about how you want to behave every single day towards somebody else, regardless of who that person is. How do you want to act? What value do you want to show other people? If these things are important to you, we can all become better versions of ourselves in a way. And of course, then the world becomes a much better place.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Sunita Sah, for that work, for your book, for helping us all to live our values a little bit, and for taking this interview, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was wonderful to be here.